Good evening and welcome to Town and Gown on this 15th of October. Let me take just a moment and tell you that on the 15th of November, the topic is going to be Johnny Logan, his search for an identity. It's the story about the Ohio frontier in the War of 1812. Johnny Logan was born into the Shawnee Nation, and early in his life he was captured and was reared by a family in Kentucky. And later on he was let return to the Native American culture. And he had a struggle the rest of his life whether he favored the white culture or whether he favored the red culture. And as the war started to emerge in the War of 1812, it became much more difficult for John because, you see, his uncle was Tecumseh. And he ended up being a scout for William Henry Harrison. Lost his life about 8 miles from Defiance, and he's buried in the fort grounds. And we will be dealing with that on November the 15th. At Schaumburg Auditorium at 7:30, and we welcome all of you. Tonight, we are thrilled to death to bring to you Lester Horowitz. Lester is the author of The Longest Raid of the Civil War, the first complete chronicle of Confederate General John Hunt Morgan's great raid in July of 1863. The book has already been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize for History. The raid route went through Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio. This raid covered more than 1,000 miles. Morgan and the remains of his force were captured just 70 miles south of Cleveland, Ohio, in Columbiana County near Lisbon. Horowitz is the first Civil War author to be filmed and broadcast nationwide on C-SPAN. His book has been the subject of 2 BBS programs. He is currently writing a new Civil War book titled, you can imagine, After the Raid. He adapted his book for the stage and wrote the musical drama that's been playing in local communities in southern Ohio called The Rebels Are Coming. It's Morgan's raid put to music. Horowitz will be glad to autograph books that he has here, and they are for sale. But before he begins to speak, I would ask you to turn off your cell phone, and after his presentation, he will answer any questions that come from the audience. Now we are pleased to introduce author-historian Mr. Lester Horowitz. Lester?
Thank you, Randy. I want to make sure that this equipment is working. Can you hear me all right in the back row? Fine. I want to thank Randy Bachman very much for inviting me to speak to you today and coming to hear the true story of the great raid into Ohio by Confederate General John Hunt Morgan. His cavalry unit was made up of 2,500 cavalry from Kentucky, Tennessee, and volunteers from many southern states, including several hundred Texas Rangers. And doing research for the book, I came across an interesting note that fighting against Morgan was Company K 1st Michigan Sharpshooters. The regiment was made up mostly of Potawatomi, Chippewa, and Ottawa Indians. They fought Morgan at Vernon, Indiana, and 3 or 4 weeks later, they were dispatched to Camp Douglas in Chicago, where they served as guards for Morgan's men who had been captured a week earlier. So first they fought him in Indiana, and then they guarded him in Chicago. How many folks here have had ancestors who were affected by the Civil War? Raise your hands. Quite a few. The 1,000-mile raid, which began in Tennessee and ended 70 miles south of Cleveland, the state of Indiana installed 24 new historic markers to the 18 that already existed there. And there were at least 35 Morgan trail markers in Ohio, but by Memorial Day of next year, Ohio will install 56 more interpretive markers and 644 Morgan Braid Heritage Trail directional signs. So in 2013, on the 150th anniversary of Morgan's raid through Ohio, there will be more than 777 trail markers for people to follow and learn more about the historic event. I was checking with the Ohio Historical Society, of which Randy was a member, and I asked them how many markers do they have in the state of Ohio for the 4 Ohio Civil War generals, you know, Ulysses Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, and Custer. And they said for those 4, there are 5 markers in the state of Ohio. Well, Morgan now is going to have over 700. So some people ask me, how come there's so many markers for Morgan and not for all those wonderful Ohio generals? And my simple answer was, they never attacked Ohio. Florence and I, my wife Florence sitting right down here in the first row, we were invited to Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the Confederacy, at the Barnes & Noble store to do a book signing there. And when we entered the store, there were magazine racks near the entrance. One rack was old-fashioned magazines, another one was food magazines, another one travel magazines. But the rack that was closest to the entrance, the sign said, current events. Every magazine in that section was a Civil War magazine. So you see in Richmond, Virginia, they're still fighting the Civil War. Now the purpose of the raid was a diversion. Down here in Tennessee, General Morgan was in McMinnville, Tennessee, and his commander, Braxton Bragg, the head of the Army of Tennessee, was in Tullahoma. And over here in Murfreesboro was the Union commander, General Rosecrans, and he was being pressured by President Lincoln to attack the Army of Tennessee. Well, Braxton Bragg got wind that he was soon to be attacked by the Union Army, and he did not want to fight in Tullahoma. He wanted to withdraw to Chattanooga, where he felt he could defend himself better. So he was worried that once he starts to withdraw, he would be attacked. So General Morgan said to General Bragg, why don't you let me take my troops up into Kentucky, and I'll have all the Yankee cavalry chasing me, and while their attention is diverted, you can pull back to Chattanooga and nobody will even know that you've left Tullahoma. Bragg says, I like that idea. Go ahead and do it. Then Morgan said, when I get up here into Kentucky, I'll cross the river into Indiana, and I'll go around Cincinnati, and then I'll come back down and join you in Chattanooga. So Bragg thought that over. He says, no, that part of your plan I don't like. I want you to stay in Kentucky. Don't cross the Ohio River into the north. Well, you just don't tell a fellow like Morgan no. He already had it in his mind that he was going to go into the north and bring the war to the northern states. Well, once he did cross the river here, the Ohio River into Indiana, Braxton Bragg said, when he comes back, I'm going to have him court-martialed for going against my orders. So that's what was waiting for Morgan on his return. Now, how did I get involved with General Morgan was because of this house. This home, Florence and I bought it in 1980. And it was built in 1840. And the realtor at the closing said, you know your home was raided by the Confederates during the Civil War. Well, I love history. So as soon as I moved in, I went down to the Historical Society to look up and find out more about this Morgan's raid who raided our home. And I found down there a book in the Historical Society, almost as thick as my book. And it listed everybody in the state of Ohio who had put in a claim after the raid. There were 4,375 claims against the rebels. And I knew who built our home and who was living there at the time of the raid. It was Nathaniel Humphrey. Morgan went through 25 counties here. So I looked up Hamilton County where we live, and we live on the border between Hamilton County and Claremont County, but we're on the Hamilton County side of the Little Miami River. So I looked up and I found Nathaniel Humphrey's name in the listing, and it said that he put in a claim for 2 horses, and he was reimbursed $155. So I realized that the realtor had told us the truth. Our home had been raided by the Confederates. So one of the things I did first is I went to the public library and I found a map drawn by the county engineer in 1869, shortly after the war. And I blew that map up 6 feet high. And then I found a similar map for the county of Claremont. And here's the Little Miami River that divides the 2 counties, and I enlarged that map to 6 feet high. And altogether it's about 25 feet long. Back in 1869, when the county engineers made up those maps, they put the names of the people who owned each lot. In fact, they even put a red dot or a black dot where the home is located. So here I had that book with 4,375 names, and I turned to Hamilton County, and I start looking for the names on the map in Hamilton County and the names in Claremont County in that book. It took me 8 months to find hundreds of places on these maps, and whenever I found the name, I put a red dot. So at the end of 8 months, I could see exactly which streets the Confederates went down. You know, some people say follow the money. I followed the claims. Now, this took up most of the living room. And we got a call from the Loveland Historical Society, and they said, your home has been nominated for the Historic Home of the Year in the greater Loveland area. Could we come over and see your home? So they came over and they walked in and they saw this map. Well, that was 1994 when they came over. We moved into the house in 1980, so for 14 years, I had been collecting stories and books and articles about Morgan's raid. And when they saw all that material, they said, you seem to know a lot about Morgan's raid. Could you and Florence co-chair a Morgan's raid exhibit at our museum next year in 1995? And we agreed to do that. And it started in January, or in March, and it ended at the end of July. The museum is only open Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, only about 2.5 to 3 hours each of those days. And there's a little book that people who visit the museum can sign when they come in, a guest register, but you're not required to sign it, so not everybody did. But at the end of the 5 months, there were over 3,000 names of people who had visited that exhibit. On the first day that the exhibit opened, I went down. I had a regular 9-to-5 job at the office, but on Saturday and Sunday I could go to the museum. And I would start to tell people what they're looking at in the glass cases. The weapons they're looking at, the photographs, the uniforms. And Joanne Richardson, the director of the museum, said, Lester, if I set up 10 chairs, would you give a little talk about Morgan's raid? So she did. And when the chairs got filled, I started off and I gave them a little talk about Morgan's raid. So Joanne said, Lester, if you'll do this next week, I'll run a little article in the newspaper. I said, sure, I'll do it. So the next week, it took 20 chairs to fill the audience. And each week, that audience got bigger and bigger until the room could hold almost 100 people, and it was completely filled, and people were sitting out in the hall, even though they couldn't see me, but they could hear me. And because it was in warm weather, she put speakers out on the porch, and people could sit out on the chairs on the porch, and I felt like the Pope addressing the multitude, you know. But after my talk, people would come up to me and say, "Mr. Horwitz, I'd like to buy your book." And I'd say, I don't have a book. And well, after 15, 20 people asked to buy the book, it finally sunk in. I ought to start taking their names down. So when they'd say, "I'd like to buy your book," I said, "Well, it isn't written yet, but when it is, I'll contact you. So here's a piece of paper, put your name and address and how I can contact you." Then my son, who lives up in Cleveland, he came down to hear my talk, and afterwards, he says, "Dad, if you don't put this down on paper, all this history is going to be lost." So that night I sat down at the computer and I started chapter 1. And 4.5 years later, in 1999, I finished the last chapter. I had written 99 chapters. And I don't know if any of you are writers and what it's like when you sit down to write, but you lose yourself in your story. You don't realize what's going on. And there was many times, I would come home from work and eat and then sit down and start writing, and I'd hear a voice yelling out, and it was my wife yelling, "It's 2:30 in the morning, you gotta go to work tomorrow, go to sleep," you know. So that's the way it was. I was just living back in 1863. And so I finished up writing it, had 99 chapters, and then I needed an editor. In fact, I found 2 editors. One editor was Ed Bars, who's from the Washington, D.C. He's the foremost historian for the Civil War in the United States. He really knows Civil War history. And he went through my 528 pages. And the other one was Dr. James Ramage, history professor emeritus at Northern Kentucky University. And he wrote the book, Rebel Raider, so he knew about Morgan. So I had the 2 finest Civil War Morgan's Raid experts read over my manuscript, and they really helped me out there. But Dr. Ramage said, "Lester, you've got 2 books here." I'd stop the first book at chapter 68 and save the other chapters for another book, which I did. And that's going to be after the raid, and I've been working on that one, and that's going to be an even bigger book. So that's how the book came about. Well, no sooner had the book been published than I got a call from C-SPAN in Washington, D.C., and they said, "Where are you going to be speaking for the next 3 months?" And I sent them my schedule, and they picked out Louisville, Kentucky, and they sent a film crew down and filmed my presentation there. And then the following month, they put it on nationwide television. And I know that every year they keep repeating it over and over again, because last month I was with another group, and a fellow said to me, "I saw you on TV last night." Well, I did that thing back in 1999, and he just saw it on TV the week before. So they're repeating it. Then I got in the mail a letter from Columbia University, and they handle the Pulitzer Prize awards. And the letter said that your book has been accepted nomination for the Pulitzer Prize, and please send review copies to the list of judges on the enclosed page, which I did. I did not win the Pulitzer Prize that year, but there were almost 1 million new books published that year, and the ones that are nominated for the Pulitzer are just a handful of books, so it was just a great honor that they selected my book for that. And finally, the last honor I got that year is the Cincinnati newspaper on Thursday would publish the top 10 best-selling books in the tri-state area. And I opened up the paper and I looked at the list, and there, number 1 was The Longest Reign of the Civil War. And I looked at the others. There was Tuesday with Maury, and there was the Princess Diane's book, Elmer Lagasse's book, and then I even outsold Dr. Atkins' diet. Now, which was very encouraging because it meant that the folks liked local history more than losing weight. The home on top is the home where General Morgan was born, June 1st, 1825, in Huntsville, Alabama. And I found out about this house, and I wanted to go down and take pictures of the home inside and out. So I called up the mayor of Huntsville, and I said, I'm writing the history of Morgan's raid, and I believe General Morgan was born in your town. He said, sure was. I said, well, could you tell me who owns that home? And he gave me the name of the lady who owns the home. So I called her up, and I told her I'm writing this history, and could I come down and take pictures inside and out of your home? She was not too cooperative. So the mayor went and took the picture for me. And if I... Not too long ago, someone sent me a magazine, Homes for Sale in Huntsville, Alabama. Look whose home is for sale. General Morgan's home. And it says back here that they're asking $1,350,000 for that home. Well, Florence and I can go see that home now, but we have to take a realtor with us. Now, the home below is the home of General Morgan's grandfather, John Wesley Hunt, in Lexington, Kentucky. And John Wesley Hunt was a multimillionaire. Now, Morgan's father was a pharmacist in Huntsville, and his business did not do well. So he couldn't keep up the payments on the real estate, mortgage, and et cetera, and taxes. So he lost this home. So his father-in-law in Lexington told him, you come up to Lexington, bring the family, I'll give you one of the farms that I own. You won't have to worry about mortgages or taxes or any of that anymore. So at the age of 6, John Hunt Morgan and his family moved up to Lexington and basically lived in this home. And this home today is a museum. And if you were to go there, they've stripped the white paint off. It's the original red brick. Here's John Hunt Morgan at the age of 38 when he led this raid. His second in command was Colonel Basil Duke, who was 25 years old. Most of the men who rode with Morgan were youngsters. They were in their early 20s and late teens. Morgan, being 38, was kind of an old man, and yet he had a wonderful constitution and a great drive. And by the end of the raid, he was still ready to fight when all the young men with him had it. They couldn't keep up with him. Duke was also his brother-in-law. He married one of Morgan's sisters. Now, Morgan had another brother-in-law, married one of his sisters, who was a general. It was General A.P. Hill, who fought with Robert E. Lee and was killed during the Civil War. This is General Braxton Bragg, who was a commander of the Army of Tennessee, Morgan's commander. And this is General Ambrose E. Burnside, the head of the Army of the Ohio, which commanded all the Union soldiers in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. This is where we get the sideburns from Burnside. Four of Morgan's brothers went with him on the raid. This is Colonel Richard Morgan, Captain Charlton Morgan, Captain Calvin Morgan, and First Lieutenant Thomas Hunt Morgan. Now, they did have another brother who was even younger, did not go on the raid with them. His name was Francis Key Morgan. Now, Francis Key sounds familiar because Francis Scott Key, who wrote our national anthem, was their cousin. Early in the raid here, when they were in Kentucky, this is Lebanon, Kentucky here. And this is a scene of the Battle of Lebanon, Kentucky. And it lasted for many, many hours. A few minutes before the Union soldiers surrendered, this Union rifleman shot and killed Thomas Hunt Morgan. So early in the raid, General Morgan lost one of his brothers. This brother, Captain Charlton Morgan, he had a son after the war. And he named his son after his brother who was killed on the raid. This is his son 1 generation later. That's Thomas Hunt Morgan 1 generation later. That Thomas Hunt Morgan in 1933 won the Nobel Prize for Medicine for his work with chromosomes and genes. And in 1966, the University of Kentucky named its new biology building the Thomas Hunt Morgan Building. You know, now when you get up into Indiana, we come to Vernon, right there. And I found out that they made a movie that included the Battle at Vernon of Morgan's men fighting the defenders of Vernon. And that movie was called Friendly Persuasion. It starred Gary Cooper and Tony Perkins as his son. Gary Cooper played the Quaker farmer. And being a Quaker, they were pacifists, and they refused to fight. In fact, in my book, on page 91, it says about 8 miles outside of Vernon, some 30 or 40 raiders stopped at the farmhouse of Joshua Vicker Millhouse. The Quaker farmer said that he and his family were treated with respect. Nothing but food was demanded, and payment was tendered by several of Morgan's men. The farmer said that they appeared to have plenty of gold, silver, and greenbacks. One of Morgan's men very cordially invited him to visit his home in Dixie when this cruel war is over. The Quaker farmer gave his opinion that the rebel chances of getting home to receive company were rather slim. The Confederate replied saying, "I suppose you'd be pleased to hear that I and all my comrades were killed or captured." The Hoosier farmer assured him that he was correct in his supposition. "Well, I like your honesty," was the Confederate reply. Now, that scene is in that movie. But the son felt that they should defend their town, helping him out because George was a wizard with the telegraph key. And he could tap into the telegraph lines. And he would say constantly that pursuing Union troops were being sent down the wrong road, could never kill the time. But he started it. Now, one of the things that go around the town, he wouldn't stop the fight because he knew that about 4 or 5 hours behind him were thousands of Union cavalry chasing him. And if he'd stop the fight, they would catch up and that'd be the end of the raid. So he would ask George, find it. So, on page 89, that message was sent to Madison, Indiana. And a young telegrapher there by the name of Luther Martin realized that that question was coming from probably from a Confederate source because he knew Morgan's men were headed that way. And he realized that if he told the truth, that if there were only 25 people guarding Madison, Indiana, that Morgan would come in and would steal things, burn things, might even kill some people. So the only thing he could do was scare Morgan away. And here's the message that he sent back to George Ellsworth. We have 3 government gunboats at the landing, and others are coming. Many soldiers are already here from Rising Sun, Lawrenceburg, Aurora, and Vevey, and others are on the way. The Union commander here has altogether 25,000 men ready to meet any attack by Morgan. Luther's quick thinking saved the town. For the next 45 years, the citizens of Madison celebrated July 12th as Luther Martin Day. They honored their local telegrapher with parades and speeches. Even schools and factories were closed. Now, George Washington is remembered for never telling a lie. Luther Martin is fondly remembered for telling a really big one. Now, if you were a young man in 1861, 1862, 1863, and you lived up here, and you wanted to join the Army, they would send you by train down to Camp Dennison in outskirts of Cincinnati. And there you would get off the train and they'd take you over here and they'd fit you up with a uniform, with a rifle. They teach you how to march, how to shoot your gun. They put you back on the train, they sent you south and right down south. If you got wounded, they brought you up by train, took you off here and put you in one of these hospital barracks. If you got well and you could fight again, they put you back on the train and sent you to fight. But if you couldn't fight anymore, they sent you back north on the train. So this was the biggest Civil War camp in Ohio during the Civil War, Camp Dennison. Now Morgan wanted to capture Camp Dennison because he figured if there's all those soldiers there, has to be a lot of horses. And that's what he needed, was fresh horses. So he went and surrounded the camp, and the commander of the camp, George Washington Neff, knew that Morgan wanted his horses. So the day before Morgan arrived, he sent all his horses down to Cincinnati for safekeeping. And Morgan realized that once he got up here, he couldn't see a damn horse in the whole area. So he realized that there are no horses, and it was useless to engage in battle because that's not what he wanted to do. So he just, in fact, George Neff, Colonel Neff, took all the men in the hospital and told them, if you're well enough to get up and shoot a gun, get in the trenches. And when Morgan shows up, shoot him. So when Morgan did show up, Morgan got a 600-gun salute aimed at him. And that was enough. He left the camp alone and he went around and crossed the river elsewhere. In doing research for my book, I found that it said July 15, 1863, that Morgan had breakfast at John Skank's farm. So I went to that map that I originally showed you where all the claims were, and I looked for John Skank, and I found his name. And I saw exactly where his farm was back in 1863. And I took a contemporary map of Greater Cincinnati and found that that farm would be in an area, a suburban area today called Deer Park, Ohio. So I called up my friend Jack Kendall, and I said, Jack, I'm going out to look for John Skank's farmhouse. You want to go with me? And he said, sure. So we drove over to Deer Park, and we're driving up and down the streets, and all of a sudden I see a street sign that says Skank Avenue. I said, we're getting warm. So we drove down the street, and I said, let's find the oldest house on this street. It has to be from the Civil War, and see if that's John Skank's farmhouse. And when I saw this house, I says, this has got to be it. So I went up to the front door, knocked on the door, and a lady by the name of Helen Ward answered, and she looked at Jack and I, and she said, what do you want? I says, I'm writing the history of Morgan's raid. Was this the home of John Skank? And a big smile came over her face, and she said, yes, come in, come in. She took us in the living room and seated us, excused herself for a moment, went and got a cardboard box and came back. And as she reached in that box to hand me what she had been saving, she said, "I've been waiting for you for years." And I tell you, the goosebumps just came out. And she proceeded to tell me the story about John Skank. She says he was a pharmacist, just like General Morgan's father was. But he also had a farm. He raised cattle and sheep. And he was also an Underground Railroad conductor. He helped escaped slaves get up to safety in Canada. And at the time of Morgan's raid, the family living, the escaped slave family's name was the Thompsons. The Thompsons were afraid, knowing Morgan was coming, that they would be captured and taken back into slavery. So Mr. Skank says, "You go in the house, go in the parlor and keep quiet." And he dressed his wife up as a nurse. And when the Confederates came up to go inside to get food, she said, "You don't want to go in there. We have children in the parlor with smallpox." And that was enough to keep the Confederates out of the house. And it saved that slave family. But along came a Confederate captain, and he says, "I hear you have illness in the family, and we don't want to expose General Morgan, but you got a porch and there's a table and chairs there. Why don't you just bring breakfast out there and have breakfast for General Morgan?" So this is where General Morgan sat on this porch at 4:30 in the morning, July 14, 1863, and that was the article that I was reading in the Cincinnati Enquirer, dated July 15. As I got up to leave, Helen Ward handed me the box. She says, "This box is yours now." And I left. A year later, Helen Ward passed away. Now, what do you think would have happened to all that history if I hadn't gone up and knocked on the door? It would have all been thrown in the garbage. And that's one of the wonderful things about writing history books. You save stories for future generations. This slave family, the Thompsons, I looked at the property maps after the Civil War, and I found that Mr. Skank deeded part of his land to the slave family. And they continued to live on his farm well after the war. And their oldest son was Aaron Belford Thompson, that he was a poet, and he moved to Indianapolis. And in 1907, he published a book of poetry called Harvest of Thoughts. And when Florence and I were doing research up at the Indiana Historical Society, they brought one of his books out to show us. And we noticed that the introduction was written by none other than the great Hoosier poet, James Whitcomb Riley. Now, you had to be a pretty good poet if James Whitcomb Riley is going to write the introduction of your book. This home is on Montgomery Road, or was on Montgomery Road until about 5 years ago when they tore it down. Thankfully, I got a picture of it before they destroyed the home. This is the home of Mr. Todd, Nicholas Todd. It's interesting, Florence and I were up in Cleveland at the Civil War Roundtable. And as soon as I mentioned Nicholas Todd, a lady in the second row said, "Oh, that's my family." And she was so excited to know that I'm telling a story about the history of her family. But Nicholas Todd came out of his home and he found that his 4 horses were stolen by the Confederates. And he put in a claim and they reimbursed him $600. But he neglected to tell the government that the Confederates left behind 2 tired horses. And those 2 tired horses, when they got well, his sons started to race those horses and win all kinds of prizes. Turns out, you know, those horses and Morgan's men came from Fayette County, Kentucky, If you're familiar with that area, that's horse country. That's thoroughbred country. And what they had left behind on Mr. Todd's farm was 2 thoroughbreds that were just saddle sore and couldn't go any further. And so the son said, we're not growing corn anymore, we're going to raise racehorses, and they built a racing stable behind what is today Moeller High School. So that's the story of Nicholas Todd. After giving the talk, one of my talks, a lady walked up and she handed me a daguerreotype, an old-fashioned film, and I enlarged it here. She says, this is my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother. My great-grandfather rode with Morgan, and he raided my great-grandmother's farm. And I says, what was her father's name? Said Deerwester. And I says, what county? Claremont. So we went to that old map that I had, and I found the Deerwester farm on Belfast Goshen Road. So I says, tell me the story. What happened? So she said, well, he and another Confederate were out looking to steal horses, fresh horses. That was something they had to do every day, constantly find fresh horses, because the horses that they would take from the farmers were not the same kind of horses that they started out with back in Kentucky. The horses that they would find in Indiana and Ohio were farm horses. So when a Confederate got on one of those horses and dug his spurs in and told the horse to jump over the fence, the only thing that went over the fence was the Confederate. The horse wouldn't go. So he was out looking for fresh horses, and he came to the farm, and he saw her sweeping the porch, and he went up, and before he took their horses, he was hungry. So he and his comrade said, could you make us something to eat? So she took them inside, and she and her mother made them a nice meal. And by the time they were done eating, he was not thinking about horses anymore. No, he was thinking about that pretty girl. And he said, when the war is over, I'm going to come back and marry you. And he did, and they had 5 children. One of the great-grandchildren gave me that photograph. So remember that map that I had with the red dots for the claims? Well, I went and looked at the Deerwester farm, and there was no red dot. No claim, no horses stolen. So I started to doubt her story. So I said, you know, he didn't steal any horses. So she put her hands on her hips and she said to me, what kind of impression you think he was going to make on his future father-in-law if he stole his horses? That's why there was no red dot. I'm going to ask Leah for one more favor. Leah, can you bring me one of the Rebels Are Coming CDs there? I wrote a musical play based on my book, and the play is called The Rebels Are Coming, and it's Morgan's Raid in Music, just the CD. And in writing the play, I knew you have to have a love story. And I figured this is as good a couple as any to put in the story for the love situation. And Florence and I, we were traveling up to Columbus. I was giving a speech up there, and I said to my wife, open up the glove compartment, take out a pad of paper, we're going to write a love song. So I said, you know, I can't think of what a woman thinks about of a man that she's going to eventually meet and marry. And I just wonder, honey, what were you thinking before you met me about the guy you were going to meet and perhaps marry? So she said, well, I wondered where I would meet him. And then I wondered, what would he look like? And finally, she said, I wondered if he would like me. So I says, great lines, good words, and that'll be the basis of the love song. So on the CD, the love song is Waiting for My True Love. And if we've only got 4 of these left. If you get one of them when you hear it, you'll understand the story behind that love song. So this was their story, and I was fortunate to get that daguerreotype. Now, there was one major battle in the state of Ohio, and it was down here in Meigs County, which I'll show you on the big map. Is right here. Here's Meigs County, just about opposite where we are up here in Defiance. And it's right on the river, and there is an island there in the middle, not in the middle. American scouts had told him that the river at this point here at the north part of the island was only about 12 to 18 inches deep. This is before they had locks and dams on the Ohio River. And so people could walk from Ohio to West Virginia without getting their knees wet. Now Morgan, when his scouts told him that, he says, that's where we're going to cross out of Ohio into West Virginia because it's too shallow for the federal gunboats to come up and stop us. And he says the only people we're going to meet up with here will be the farmers, and the farmers aren't going to be able to stop us. So they went all the way across Ohio to that point to be able to cross the Ohio River back into the South. Now when I say the South, West Virginia, because West Virginia seceded from the South in April of 1863. They cut themselves off of Virginia. But there were still a lot of people living in West Virginia that were sympathized with the Southerners, and Morgan knew that once he got into West Virginia, he would get plenty of aid. So Morgan's men came down this road from Chester, Ohio, but he got here after dark. And his scouts told him that there were hundreds of men, soldiers, guarding that northern tip. And they had cannons. So Morgan thought, okay, let's wait till the first light of morning when we can see the enemy. And then we'll get across the river. But another thing that Morgan found out is that there had been heavy rains in the West Virginia mountains. And now the river, instead of being this shallow, was well over a man's head. And it was deep enough now for federal gunboats, the USS Moose and the Allegheny Belle, to come up there. So at the first light of morning, when Morgan's men tried to get across here, he found that the soldiers had vacated that embankment and had gone over to the West Virginia side, and that these gunboats were there. And Morgan's men tried to cross. About 50 of them got across safely, but the rest of them were stopped by the gunboats, and there were many Confederate hats floating down the river indicating that those fellows never made it. Well, as soon as the gunboats opened fire, it alerted the Union troops that were pursuing Morgan down the same road. That was General Hobson with about 3,000 Union cavalry. Coming up from Pomeroy Road in the south was another Union general, General Judah, with 4,000 cavalry. So on the morning of Sunday, July 19, you had 2,000 Confederates, 3,000 Union, 4,000 Union. You had 8,000 to 10,000 men fighting in Ohio. Not too many Ohioans know that there was this major battle in our state during the Civil War, and it occurred on July 19. Morgan went up this way to get away from them, and he escaped with half of his men. So he escaped with about 1,000 men and went up to Reedsville, Ohio, where they started to cross the river again. They got about 300 of them across safely when the gunboat showed up. General Morgan was out in the middle of the river saying, "Come on, let's get out of Ohio, get into West Virginia." And all of a sudden the gunboats start firing on the men, and Morgan realized there were still 600 men left in Ohio who couldn't get across the river. And they weren't about to try to cross with all those gunboats shooting at them. So Morgan turned around and went back to Ohio to help the men who were still stuck in Ohio. He could have easily gotten away with the 300 that made it safely across, but he instead chose to go to try to save the men in Ohio. After that, the men realized that General Morgan was willing to give up his life for them, and they did everything they could to preserve his life and sacrifice their own. And in fact, after the war, they built a statue of General Morgan on his horse, and it's in downtown Lexington in the courthouse square. And there's something unique about that statue that you won't find anywhere else in the United States. On the base, it has his name, General John H. Morgan, and then there's 3 words added, and his men. General Morgan and his men, because they were inseparable. And they, after the war, they formed the Morgan's Men Association, because Morgan was killed near the end of the war. And Duke, his second in command, became the first president of the Morgan's Men Association. And they kept it going until today. There are about 450 descendants of Morgan's men. After one of my talks, 3 men came up to me and they identified themselves as descendants of Morgan's men. And they said, we're from the Morgan's Men Association, and the man in the middle says, I'm the commander-in-chief. And he said to me, you talk pretty good for a Yankee. He said, we want to make you an honorary member of the Morgan's Men Association. And they put this pin on me, and I'm about the only Yankee that's welcome in their camp. In fact, one of the first groups that I spoke to back in '99 was the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And they invited me over to give a talk, and there were about 15 women around the table. And as I sat down, the program chairman, she said to me, Mr. Horwitz, I know you talked for about an hour. Can you cut it to 30 minutes? Because these ladies are going to fall asleep on you. And I noticed that one of them had oxygen. I hope she lasted through my talk. But the funny thing is, after the end of the half hour, I opened it up to question and answer, and for the next hour, they were asking questions and nobody was sleeping. But one lady sitting next to me, she said, Mr. Horwitz, 5 years ago, they wouldn't allow me to sit at the same table with you because you're a Yankee. So that's how things, even this close a date. Fighting at the Battle of Buffington Island was Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes, later to become the 19th President of the United States. Fighting alongside Colonel Hayes was Lieutenant William McKinley, later to become the 25th President of the United States. So at the Battle of Buffington Island, 2 future U.S. presidents were fighting Morgan. And Hayes' home is up in Fremont. And I went up there and I read his diary, and he described how it was that he fought and beat Morgan at that battle. I was very proud of that. Morgan not only had to fight the Union cavalry, but he had to fight Union Navy, which was the USS Moose and the Allegheny Belle. And the captain, or the commander of the USS Moose, was Lieutenant Commander Leroy Fitch. And it was his use of gunboats that kept Morgan from crossing out of Ohio. Now we're coming to the close of the battle, of the chase. And now we're up here in Columbiana County. And this is Lisbon, just north of Route 518. But as soon as they saw the 350 hardcore soldiers, they turned around and ran back to Lisbon. But they captured the Lisbon commander, Captain James Burbick. And Morgan said to Burbick, I've got a deal for you.
Stings.
Get out of Ohio. That's the deal. So Burbick said, yes, sir. So as they were coming down the road here, Morgan looked back and he saw a big dust cloud coming up behind him. He knew that was not his men, and that dust cloud was moving very fast, so those were fresh horses. Had to be Union cavalry. And he did not want to surrender to the Union soldiers. So he turned to his prisoner, James Burbick, and he said, we want to surrender to you. And Burbick was shocked. They had taken his guns away, they had taken his horse, and now all these Confederates want to surrender to him. He couldn't figure that one out. So he says, he started to stammer. Morgan said, here are my terms. We get to keep our sidearms, we get to keep our horses, and we'll sign a parole of honor saying that we're not going to fight you anymore, and you'll let us go home. And Burbick said, I don't know anything about surrender.
Later, but I want you to.
So, you know, Kentucky was split between Union and Confederate. That was brother against brother. And here, the last few miles of the raid, it was Kentuckians chasing Kentuckians through Ohio. So Rue said to Morgan, surrender to me. And Morgan said, I've already surrendered. And we men, if they're ready to fight. And those men had been in the saddle for 24 days. Hadn't had a look on your maps of Ohio, it says Morgan Surrender Monument.
Yes.
But he was fortunate to have been sent to the Ohio Penitentiary instead of Camp Douglas or any of the other prisoner of war camps. Here, they put him on two levels. Morgan was on an upper level and his brother Richard was on one at the lower level. And a captain, Thomas Henry Hines, saw that the cell that he was in, the floor was dry and the walls were moist. And he figured there had to be air down there to keep the floor so dry. So he started to chisel through the concrete and brick until he found an air chamber. And he saw the air chamber went the entire length of the prison. So he got word to General Morgan, we can break out of here. So when Morgan said, start digging a trench, and they dug a trench, it took them 2 to 3 weeks to dig a trench out to the prison yard. And at midnight, Morgan knew that there was a train leaving. He got hold of a Columbus Dispatch. And in the Columbus Dispatch, it said that there was a train leaving at 1:30 in the morning from Columbus for Cincinnati. Now, the train station is 2 blocks away from the prison. Of course, they've torn that prison down about 6, 8 years ago, but that's where the Ohio Penitentiary was. And this was a drawing made during the Civil War showing Morgan's men escaping over the prison walls. And the next day, the Army put out a poster, a $1,000 reward for the capture of Morgan. But Morgan and Thomas Henry Hines, they went down to the train station and they bought tickets to go to Cincinnati. Their families had sent them money inside Bibles, so they used that money to buy the train tickets. And when Morgan went to sit down in the train, he didn't sit down next to Captain Hines, but he saw a Union officer sitting over there, and he went and sat down next to that Union officer and engaged him in conversation, and they split a flask of whiskey. And by the time they pulled out of the train station and went by the prison wall, the Union colonel said to Morgan, "We've got General John Hunt Morgan safe and sound in there." Morgan just could smile. So he did come down to Cincinnati with Hines. They jumped off the train before it went into the railroad depot because he was afraid that the Union Army would be waiting for him, figuring that they knew he had escaped. And then they went down to the river, and this was before there were any bridges across the Ohio River. The suspension bridge was not completed until after the Civil War. So there was a young fellow with a rowboat, And he would row people across the river to Kentucky and back over to Ohio for 50 cents a person. And so when Morgan and Captain Hines got into the boat, they gave him $1. And he just sat there. And they said, "Fella, what are you waiting for?" He said, "I got room for 2 more people." So they pulled out another $1 and said, "Start rowing." They got him across the river, and he jumped off and went up to Mrs. Ludlow's home. If you go to northern Kentucky, there's Ludlow, Kentucky, and this is built around her home. And she was a Southern sympathizer. And Morgan knew that, so he went up to her home, knocked on her door, and when she recognized who it was, she took him inside, he and Captain Hines. And she gave them food and fresh clothes and money, and her son then took him to the next safe house. And they went from safe house to safe house until they got all out of Kentucky into Tennessee. Now I'm going to close by reading part of the epilogue. And after I read the epilogue, I'll be glad to answer a few of your questions, and then I'll be happy to autograph any books for you up there in the hall. Ohio and Indiana can well be grateful to John Hunt Morgan. He left behind some of the best thoroughbred stock, jaded though they were. Had it not been for the audacity of that colorful Confederate cavalry commander, the Hoosier and Buckeye states would have had no Civil War battlefields to commemorate, Cordon and Buffington Island. Columbiana County, Ohio would not have had the honor of being the high water mark of the Confederacy penetration into the North. The Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus would have been denied a great mystery and a tourist attraction. I didn't know if I showed you, they put up a sign from the cell where Morgan escaped, cell from which General Morgan escaped November 27th, 1863, and they wouldn't put anybody else in that cell. Guess who bought the cell door? Remember that fellow who says, you talk pretty good for a Yankee, the commander-in-chief? He bought the cell door, and it's in his barn down in Lexington, Kentucky. Columbus would have been denied a tourist attraction, and countless present-day Ohioans and Hoosiers would have been deprived of the opportunity to boast of ancestral beds occupied by Morgan. In my research, I found more people who claimed that he ate in their home, held their children, and slept in their beds in 2.5 weeks, that he was in Indiana and Ohio, than all the homes that George Washington was supposed to have slept in during the entire American Revolution. More than 6,570 Ohioans and Hoosiers went on record as having Morgan pay them a house call. Thank you. Who's got the first question? Richard, bring a mic down for this gentleman here.
Thank you. When you mention a claim being filed by a landowner or a farmer, who was it filed? Who accepted that claim, or who was
Very
it filed
good question. Very quick. You would think it was federal government. It wasn't. It was the state of Ohio. And the reason why is because Governor David Todd, was governor of Ohio at the time. And of course, he gets elected. You have to vote for him. And when he got a letter from somebody in Ohio that said, "The rebels took my horses. Why aren't you protecting my home?" So the governor says, "I'll send him a check for his horses." And then he told, the governor sent me some money for horses. Hey, they took your horses too. Why don't you contact the governor? Well, then the letters started to pour into the governor. And he says, well, we got to do this in an organized manner. So he appointed a 3-man commission, and they just drove the entire rail route, stopping at each town and asking people to make their claims. And then you had to have somebody else vouch that you're telling the truth. You couldn't just do it on your own word. So that's how they did it, and so the state of Ohio paid those claims. Those claims amounted to well over $500,000. which is big money back then because an entire meal cost 25 cents. Next question. The young fellow back there, just a moment. It's going to give you the mic.
Were there any other people who escaped the penitentiary?
I didn't hear it too closely.
Were there any other people who escaped the penitentiary?
Oh, besides General Morgan and Captain Hines, yes. There were 6 captains, Hines being one of them, plus General Morgan. And they all escaped, but every one of them was captured except General Morgan and Captain Hines. The others were tracked down and captured. Good question, thank you. Any other questions? This gentleman here, Richard.
Do you know of any preservation efforts going on at Portland or Buffington Island?
The question is, do I know of any
preservation efforts?
Preservations of Buffington Island? Well, I do know that an Irish mining firm came in and bought up a third of the battlefield because they wanted the gravel. And if you were to visit that field, between the corn stalks, the gravel is just laying on top of the earth. So it's very rich in gravel. When we heard that they were buying up the battlefield, we immediately organized a preservation group to stop it. And we raised money. We went around to the people who hadn't sold off their land yet, and we told them, we're going to give you money not to sell your land. We don't want to own your land. You still own your land. But here's money. If you accept it, you promise not to sell your land to the mining people. And they couldn't figure that one out. They thought there's got to be a catch there. But enough of them went along with it, and we've preserved 2/3 of the battlefield at least. Any other? Yes, sir.
What happened to the rest of the troops that were captured?
What happened
Morgan.
to the rest of Morgan's men?
Yes.
Well, they were put into different prisons. I mentioned that 60 of the officers went into the Columbus Penitentiary. Most of his men were sent to Camp Douglas in Chicago. And in fact, there was a book written to Die in Chicago, if you recall that book. And the front cover of that book were all of Morgan's men as a group who came in at one time. And they took a picture, and that's the picture they use on that cover. But so they were put into Camp Douglas, they were put into Camp Chase in Columbus, and they were put into Johnson Island up in Lake Erie. Those that were put into Johnson Island had it really tough because when winter came along, you know, they froze to death. A lot of them got pneumonia and couldn't survive. And some of them even were put into Western Pennsylvania Penitentiary. And if you were to go over there in Pittsburgh, they've got the plaque where the penitentiary once stood and where Morgan's men were incarcerated. So they went to a lot of different prisons. Eventually, they were all shipped towards the East Coast, and then by the end of the war, they were all let go. Oh, I wanted to show you one thing about this picture of General Morgan. This is the outfit he was wearing when they captured him. He was wearing a jacket like what I'm wearing, and he wore gray jeans, high leather boots, and his hat was tipped up on one side, as you'll notice. And the reason why it was tipped up like that is back in the Civil War, they fought with swords. And if you didn't tip up your hat, you'd be knocking your hat off all the time. Also, when you sight on your rifle, it got your head out of the way so you could sight on that. So you can tell he was a righty, the way, and if you see pictures of anybody from that era with their hat tipped up on this side, then they were lefties. When I addressed a group of students at a school, and I asked for questions, one of the young boys said to me, "Why didn't they just shoot General Morgan, and that would have been the end of the raid?" And I said, "Look what he was wearing." I said, you got 2,500 soldiers. Many of them were wearing uniforms. But General Morgan and some others were just wearing civilian clothes. And it looked like they were just camp followers. And so you wouldn't shoot at a civilian, you would be shooting at a general who had stars. But Morgan didn't wear a uniform like that, so he tried to keep himself from being a target for snipers, and there were a lot of snipers.